Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm Simona Rasek. I'm a committee member with the San Diego District Export Council, and I wear other hats in the trade community. I'm the Director of Global Trade at Getting to Global. I am a Los Angeles SBDC Export Advisor and the President of Women in Trade Orange County Chapter. Today, I will discuss the International Chamber of Commerce Uniform Rules for Digital Trade Transactions, known as URDTT, within the context of the Electronic Digital Trade Transaction Workspace, known as eDTT Workspace. The eDTT Workspace is used for managing international trade transactions online using electronic documents instead of paper. The ICC Uniform Rules for Digital Trade Transactions version 1.0 was published on October 1st, 2021, so recently. The URDTT provides a framework that applies to each party or person that participates in a digital trade transaction. The definition from the ICC for digital trade transaction is a process as agreed between the principal parties, whereby electronic records are used to evidence the underlying sale and purchase of goods or services and the incurring of a payment obligation. The link to the URDTT rules is in a description of the video, so make sure you download it and read it. Next slide, please. The eDTT Workspace incorporates URDTT rules in its trade transaction electronic documents and process. The workspace is available to all business worldwide at no cost. It is used for structuring digital trade transactions and for EUCP letter of credit presentation. The objective of the eDTT Workspace is to assure payment for the exchange of title of goods and services between a buyer and a seller. Assurance of payment is totally dependent on the parties to the transaction following proper digital transaction guidelines and rules. The link to the workspace is included in the video description. Preliminary consideration for the URDTT are as follows. The URDTT rules are intended for a fully digital environment, to be neutral with regard to technology and messaging standards, and to extend into the corporate space and non-bank providers of financial services. Next slide, please. The concept for the URDTT is simple and straightforward. The buyer, the obligor, initiates a digital trade transaction with a purchase order supported with a principal payment obligation to the seller, the beneficiary. The terms and conditions of the purchase order are defined by a digital trade payment facility. The payment method is a collection from buyer in exchange for the seller shipping documents to include the bill of lading, packing list, invoice, and other trade documents. The buyer may nominate a financial services provider, also known as FSP, to irrevocably undertake the principal payment obligation and make the payment on behalf of the buyer. The financial service provider may be a financial institution or a person who undertakes the irrevocable payment obligation. And this is the beauty of URDT rules. The FSP can be a non-bank provider of financial services. The FSP may also be the ultimate buyer. Note that the FSP payment undertaking must be issued in accordance with all applicable laws. The digital shipping documents are used for negotiation and payment and are presented electronically in accordance with the URDT rules and EUCP guidelines. After payment, the hard copies may be couriered to the buyer or ultimate buyer if they are needed to clear customs, like in the case of an ocean shipment. Next slide. We are next going to go through each article of the URDT. Again, you can find a link to the rules in the description of the video. You can download it and read it. I will only highlight some of the important elements of the articles. Article 1 defines the scope of the URDTT. The URDTT provides a framework that applies to each party, financial institution, or person that participates in a digital trade transaction. As mentioned before, a digital trade transaction is defined as a process as agreed between the principal parties, whereby electronic records are used to evidence the underlying sale and purchase of goods or services and the incurring of a payment obligation. The URDT shall apply when the terms and conditions of a digital trade transaction specify that it is subject to these rules. So in your export documentation, you must specify that the transaction is subject to the URDT rules. The URDTT are binding on each party or person unless and to the extent expressly modified or excluded by the terms and conditions of that digital trade transactions. Let's move to Article 2. Article 2 includes definitions. I'm just going to highlight beneficiary means the seller, buyer means a purchaser of goods or services, electronic record means data stored by electronic means. We can move to Article 2, Part 2. These are the important definitions that I would like to highlight from Article 2 as well. Financial services provider, FSP, is a person or corporate other than a principal party. FSB Payment Undertaking means an undertaking to effect payment to the beneficiary of a payment obligation. Obligor means a buyer that incurs a payment obligation. Party means a buyer, seller, or a financial service provider. Continuing with definitions. Payment obligation means an obligation incurred by a buyer. Person means a person or company. Principal party means a buyer or a seller. Seller means a seller of goods or services. Buyer means a purchaser of goods or services. Let's move to Article 4, defines the roles of the seller and the buyer. The role of the seller includes the delivery of goods or the supply of services in accordance with the terms and conditions of a digital trade transactions, providing information required to enable the delivery of goods or the supply of services, and providing any additional information as may be required, including electronic records of certificates of inspection and insurance. The role of the buyer next includes taking delivery of goods or receiving services, taking delivery of goods or receiving services that comply with the terms and conditions of the digital trade transaction. Upon compliance with the terms and conditions of the digital trade transactions by the seller, incurring an unconditional payment obligation and effecting payment in accordance with that payment obligation. Next article is a very important article. It is, as I said before, the beauty of URDT. It defines the role of the financial services provider. The role of the financial services provider provides finance to a seller or buyer. Yes, it could provide finance to both, an effective payment to a seller. Let's discuss next the payment obligation. Payment obligation is incurred by the buyer upon delivery of goods and services by seller. When a payment obligation is stated to be conditional, the obligation of the buyer is to pay upon compliance with the terms and conditions of the digital trade transaction by the seller. As of that moment, the payment obligation is automatically amended to become unconditional and independent of the transaction. Article 13, FSP Payment Undertaking. An important element of this article, or part of this article, is that there may be more than one FSP payment undertaking added to a payment obligation. In this event, each financial services provider will be severally and individually liable, severally and individually liable to the extent of its FSP payment undertaking, an important part of Article 13. Let's move to the new trade document. This is a new trade document under the URDTT. It is called Principal Payment Obligation, or PPO. It is used for digital trade transactions to evidence the payment obligation to the beneficiary. You can download this form from the eDTT Workspace. You can find the link in the video description. The next new trade document is called FSP Principal Payment Undertaking, or PPU. The PPU is used to transfer a principal payment obligation to the beneficiary of that payment obligation. Again, you can find this document and download it from the eDTT Workspace. Summary of our short presentation and discussion today is that URDT are universal digital trade transaction rules for buyers and sellers. There are no commercial banks involved, therefore there are no bank fees to be incurred. There are no courier delays in payment, and there is no paper in the transactions. The eDTT Workspace incorporates the ICC URDTT rules and helps increase international trade transactions by reducing the cost and complexity of trade. Please contact my colleague, John Dunlop, or me if you have any questions at the email listed on this slide, and find the link to the eDTT Workspace in the description of the video. Thank you for taking the time to learn how new technology and International Chamber of Commerce rules and guidelines allow us to trade in new ways and build solutions like the eDTT Workspace to help MSME structure trade transactions online without commercial banks. Thank you and see you soon.